Have you ever looked at something enormous? A bridge, a dam, a city skyline at 2 in the morning, and felt, underneath all the awe, a small and quiet discomfort? Not because the thing itself is wrong, but because you find yourself wondering in the way you usually don't let yourself wonder in daylight? Who paid for it in ways that didn't make it onto the plaque? And have you ever considered that the most famous structure in all of human history, the one on every postcard, every coin, every school poster about the wonders of the ancient world, might have been, underneath all that dressed stone and imperial authority, one of the most extraordinary acts of wishful thinking the world has ever committed to physical form? That the people who built it suspected it wouldn't hold. That the commanders who staffed it knew the gates could be bribed. That the emperors who commissioned it understood that the problem they were trying to solve was not, at its core, a problem that stone could solve. And they built it anyway. 2,000 miles of it, across the coldest, highest, most inhospitable terrain in northern Asia, at a cost in human life that no official record has ever been willing to fully name. Because tonight's story is about the Great Wall of China, the one the laborers built, not the one the emperors commissioned, the one that has been standing in the mountains of northern China for over 2,000 years, waiting for someone to come and ask, who carried this stone? Who lit these fires? Who spent the only years they had standing on this ridge in the cold, watching the dark for something that usually didn't come? That's tonight's story. Welcome to Sleep Saga, where we take the stranger, older, more human corners of history and build them into something long enough to drift inside of. I'm so glad you found this tonight. If these stories have been helping you sleep, it means everything. Please take a second to subscribe and tap the bell, because that's how this channel keeps going. And if you're already settling in and the night is feeling right, a like before you close your eyes is always appreciated. Okay, turn the lights down. Pull whatever warmth you have a little closer. Tonight, we're heading somewhere cold. The mountains of northern China, the edge of the known world, the place where the stone meets the sky. That's where we're going. Let us begin.
Let's set the scene. Before there was a wall, there was a line. Not a physical line, no stone, no mortar, no tower rising out of the morning fog. Just a feeling, understood by everyone who lived near it, that the world beyond a certain horizon operated by different rules than the world you were standing in. Step north of it, and the landscape changed, flatter, colder, more open. Step far enough north, and everything you relied on, the market town, the tax collector, the irrigation channel, the neighbor who owed you a favor, stopped existing. You were in a different kind of world, the world of the steppe. You are in northern China, and it is late autumn, probably around 1,000 years before the Common Era begins. The air has that particular quality of high northern plateaus, thin and cold, and so clean it almost has a taste, like something just before rain, but never quite arriving. The Yellow River bends south of you, carrying its famous silt toward a sea you've never seen. To the north, the land opens up into something that doesn't have a neat edge to it. The steppes, the great interior of Asia, grassland rolling toward Mongolia and Siberia, and the theoretical end of the world, which turns out to be considerably further away than it looks from here. The problem is simple. It is the same problem that will occupy the next 3,000 years of Chinese military and political thinking, right up until the moment it stops being relevant and becomes a tourist attraction. Farmers cannot chase nomads. This is not a moral judgment. It is a logistical observation. The people of the steppe, the Xiongnu Confederacy in the period we're moving toward, and before them others, and after them others still, are mounted and mobile and organized around a way of life that is genuinely, structurally difficult to fight on its own terms. They follow the grass. They herd horses and cattle across hundreds of miles of open terrain. They can cover 500 miles in the time it takes a grain farmer to decide whether to repair his roof before the first frost. When steppe raiders hit a border settlement, taking livestock, grain, sometimes people, they are gone before any organized response can be assembled. When a Chinese army follows them into the steppe, the nomads simply become unavailable. They melt into the grasslands like smoke into open air, and the pursuing force finds itself 3 weeks from home with no supply lines, no fixed enemy, and horses that are expressing serious reservations about this entire enterprise. Then the nomads come back, and the army limps south, and then the nomads raid again. Spoiler: this cycle does not resolve quickly. What makes the situation genuinely interesting, what makes it worth lying in the dark at midnight and thinking about, is that the Chinese states of the early Zhou period did not lack intelligence or military capacity or administrative sophistication. They lacked the ability to fight the kind of war that the steppe required: fast, decentralized, supply light, willing to follow an enemy into territory where the only landmarks are the positions of the stars. The Chinese way of war was siege, formation, the organized confrontation of organized forces against an enemy that never needed to stand still. It was like trying to catch rain in a net. Technically possible, never efficient, perpetually exhausting. The Zhou dynasty, in its early confident centuries, managed the frontier through a combination of allied border tribes, strategic marriages, and the time-honored practice of paying people to leave you alone, which every dynasty and most large organizations since have rediscovered independently. But the payments required silk and grain, and the allied tribes had their own interests, and the border was always, at bottom, a negotiation rather than a fact. The steppe wind came down from the north at night, cold and honest. No paperwork, no checkpoint, no army in the world positioned to argue with it. And in the bones of everyone who lived along that frontier, there was the low, permanent knowledge that the line they'd drawn was a line only in their own understanding, and that the dark to the north had never agreed to it. Welcome to the world before the wall. Let's talk about the walls that came before the wall. This is the detail that tends to vanish in the postcard version of the story. So let's state it clearly. When Qin Shi Huang built his famous unified wall in the 3rd century BCE, he did not build it on empty ground. He built it on top of, between, and around a patchwork of regional walls that already existed, walls that the various competing warring states had built against each other and against the northern frontier, spread across decades of mutual hostility, and which added up, viewed from above, to something that was almost a continuous fortification, but wasn't quite, like a sentence that has all the right words in it, but no one has put the punctuation in yet. The Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, was exactly what it sounds like. 7 major kingdoms, plus a scatter of smaller ones, all trying to consume each other in a conflict that went on long enough that people born at its beginning had great-grandchildren who died at its end. War was the default condition. Defensive walls were the obvious response. The state of Wei built walls against Qin. The state of Zhao built walls against the Yan and against the northern nomads. the state of Yan built walls against everyone in both directions simultaneously. By the end of the period, enough rammed earth walling had been raised across northern China that if you could have floated above it and connected the dots, you would have seen the shadow of something that hadn't quite become the Great Wall yet, but was clearly trying. The technique was hangtu, rammed earth. You build a wooden frame, you pack layers of earth and gravel, and sometimes lime inside it. You pound it down in successive layers until the compacted mass reaches something approaching the density of soft stone. Then you move the frame up and repeat. Faster than cut stone, cheaper, adequate for keeping out cavalry, at least in theory, at least on the good days. The walls were not elegant, 3 or 4 meters high, sometimes topped with a low, crenellated parapet, strictly utilitarian in the way that things built quickly under budget pressure in someone else's territory tend to be. But they worked, more or less, in the way that locks work. They were not there to stop a determined expert. They were there to make the casual intrusion a little more effortful. And someone had to watch. This is where the fires come in. The watchtower system was ancient before any of the major walls existed. Every stretch of fortification had towers spaced at intervals. Roughly a few hundred meters was the standard. Close enough that a fire on one tower was visible from the next, even in poor conditions. You light your fire. The guard on the next tower sees it and lights theirs, and so on down the chain until the signal reaches somewhere with the authority and resources to act on it. It is, when you think about it, a data network. Information traveling at the speed of visual confirmation across vast distances through the medium of fire and the attention of human beings standing in cold places and hoping they don't fall asleep. At night, on the warring states frontier, the watchtower fire is the most interesting thing you can look at. You are a guard in the state of Zhao, 2 weeks' walk from the nearest town, posted to a stretch of rammed earth wall that keeps guard over a valley that nothing particularly notable has ever come through. And the fire you have lit, officially a signal apparatus, practically your only source of warmth, is the brightest thing in 30 miles of darkness. You feed it carefully, a piece of wood at a time. You watch the flames take it, and in some private and wordless part of you, you feel that as long as the fire burns, the dark is navigable. That somewhere down the wall, another guard is watching another fire, and the line of lights runs east and west like the most expensive and least cheerful necklace ever made. Remember this fire. It's going to come back. Because the fire already has a history, even this early, and not all of it is reassuring. Around 770 BCE, in the twilight years of the Western Zhou, before the warring states, when the Zhou kings still held nominal authority over a crumbling federation of feudal lords, there is a story. A king, a concubine, and the signal fires. King Yu of Zhou had a concubine named Bao Si. She was, by all accounts, spectacularly beautiful and spectacularly impossible to amuse. She almost never smiled. The king, who loved her with the particular intensity of a man who has decided that her happiness is his responsibility, tried everything. Nothing worked. And then someone, the records are coy about exactly whose idea this was, suggested lighting the beacon fires. No threat existed. It was a spectacle, a joke, a firework. When the feudal lords came galloping in from their distant provinces, red-faced and underarmed and furious at having been mobilized unnecessarily, Bao Si, confronted with this tableau of expensive futility, apparently found it funny. The king was delighted. The lords were not. And when the real threat arrived later, the Zhou's northern neighbors, with serious intentions, the king lit the fires again, and no one came, because they thought it was another joke. The Western Zhou fell. Bao Si passed into legend as the woman who destroyed a dynasty with a smile. Whether the story is literally true is, as historians like to say, contested. Whether it names something emotionally true about signal systems that depend on the credibility of the people operating them, that's not contested at all. The walls of the warring states crumbled with their builders, but the towers kept their fires burning, and the habit of watching and the long, cold, wakeful discipline of standing at the edge of the known world and looking north. Forget the postcard image. Here is what unification actually felt like. It is 221 BCE. 2 centuries of the warring states have ground millions of people into the earth. In battle, in famine, in the kind of mass conscription and forced migration that empires treat as logistics and individuals experience as the end of their lives. The period ends not with a treaty or a mourning when everyone woke up and decided to be reasonable. It ends because one state, Qin, the westernmost, the one the other states had always privately regarded as semi-barbarian, the one with the most disciplined army and the fewest scruples about unconventional tactics, absorbed everything. 6 kingdoms in 15 years. The man responsible for this gave himself a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. No existing title was adequate for what he'd done, so he invented one. He was, depending on the century of the writer and the nationality of the scholar, either the greatest administrator in Chinese history or one of its most ruthless autocrats. The honest answer is that he was almost certainly both, and the ratio shifts depending on whether you were a court official or a conscripted peasant. Spoiler: most people were the latter. He standardized everything: written characters, weights, and measures, the width of cart axles so vehicles could use the same ruts in the road across the entire empire, which is either a visionary insight into infrastructure logistics or an extremely controlling thing to legislate, depending on your patience for bureaucracy. He built roads. He built canals. He built a palace of reportedly extraordinary dimensions. He burned books he didn't approve of, which historians have not forgiven. And he killed scholars he didn't like, which historians have also not forgiven. And he conscripted laborers by the hundreds of thousands for projects of national ambition, which historians tend to note more neutrally than probably they should. And he had a problem. North of the Yellow River Bend, moving fast over the grasslands with a kind of organizational efficiency that no one had quite managed to document or defeat in a lasting way, was a confederation of nomadic peoples, the Chinese texts called the Jiongnu. Their leader, the Chanyu Mao Dun, had unified the steppe tribes into something that functioned less like a pastoral collective and more like a mobile state with serious military capacity. And the first emperor had just spent 15 years and enormous blood making China into one thing, and the idea that something to the north could simply raid into that thing, take what it wanted, and disappear before any response arrived. This did not sit well with him. Understatement of the century. It sat with him the way a stone sits in a shoe. His response was a general named Meng Tian, and somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 men. The historical sources disagree on this by a margin that suggests at least one of them was guessing, sent north with a mandate to push the Xiongnu back beyond the Yellow River bend, and then build something definitive along the line they'd cleared. What Meng Tian built was the first Great Wall. Not from nothing. He connected the existing walls of the former Zhao, Yan, and Qin states, extended them where they ended prematurely, and ran the resulting fortification along the northern frontier for, depending on how you measure it and which source you trust, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 li. These estimates vary as much as they possibly could, which is partly a problem of measurement and partly a problem of different dynasties claiming credit for different sections, which is the kind of historiographical tangle that is very interesting if you are a scholar and very frustrating if you are trying to write a summary. Here is the thing about this wall that the postcard version never mentions. It was not primarily defensive, or rather, it was defensive in the same way that a very expensive lock on a door that also has windows is defensive. It was a declaration. It was the first emperor drawing a line in stone and saying, "Up to here, I am in charge. Beyond here, you are not my problem." And the psychological function of this declaration, both for the people behind the wall and for the emperor himself, was, if anything, more important than the military one. The Xiongnu, for their part, mostly found other routes. But the wall was there, and it was visible, and it was enormous. And sometimes that's the point. Let's start with the man who cut the stone. What comes next in this story is the part that history tends to skip, or to mention in a subordinate clause, or to gesture toward and then move away from before the gesture can fully land. So let's stay with it. His name, for our purposes, is Wei Liang. He is from a village in Shandong province, 12 days' walk south of where the construction project is underway. He is 23 years old. He is a farmer, a good one, the kind who has learned to read weather by the color of the eastern sky, and who knows which field wants more water in a dry summer, and which wants less. His wife, Liu, is at home with their 2 children, a boy of 4 named Bao, a girl of 7 named Mei. When the imperial conscription notice arrived in their village, Wei Liang packed what he was told to pack: a spare pair of sandals, enough food for the walk, a change of clothes that he folds carefully into a cloth he usually uses for carrying grain. And he walked north, because the alternative to going was to be found, and the alternative to being found was considerably worse. The corvée system, the labor tax, was the mechanism by which the Qin and every subsequent dynasty converted individual human bodies into imperial projects. You could owe your taxes in grain, in silk, or in labor. Under the first emperor, labor obligations could be called in at any time, for any duration the state determined was necessary. The wall needed men, and the state had men, and the machinery for converting one into the other was efficient in the particular way that systems are efficient when the people at the top do not experience the consequences of their decisions. Wei Liang turns out to be good at cutting stone. He has never cut stone before arriving at the work site, but he is strong, and he is steady, and the overseer who assigns him to the cutting crew has, in 20 years of running imperial construction projects, found that the fastest way to identify useful people is to put them to work and watch. The tools are adequate: iron chisels, wooden mallets, occasionally a bronze pick for the harder facework. The stone is less accommodating: granite from the mountain ridges, which does not submit politely to an iron chisel on a cold morning, and which has the particular quality of making every misdirected strike feel deeply personal. In the mornings, they eat millet porridge. In the evenings, they eat millet porridge. When the supply cart has come recently, there is sometimes a piece of dried fish in the porridge, which represents the upper ceiling of culinary achievement on the northern construction frontier. The overseer receives enough provisions to run his crew, and the official above him receives enough to distribute downward. And by the time the allocation reaches the men who are actually lifting the stones, something has been lost in transit, which is the nature of rations in every army and every labor camp in the long history of organized human effort. The cold is constant. In the winter months, which arrive early and stay late in the mountains of the north, the cold has a physical weight, like being slowly pushed toward the earth by something invisible and patient. Wei Liang has been told he will be home in 1 year. He knows this is not true. The overseer who told him knows it is not true. The imperial bureaucrat who calculated the labor requirements for the northern fortification project knew somewhere in the margin of his scroll that the project would absorb the better part of a generation. But 1 year is the number that makes men leave their families without deserting on the road. And so 1 year is the number that is always given. Now it is the 3rd year. The construction in Wei Liang's sector has moved along the mountain ridge above the Yellow River bend, and the wall is rising, and the cold has been severe, and one of the men in the crew, a quiet person from Henan who never talked much and was good at carrying things, died in the 2nd winter and was buried where he fell, on the mountain, because there was no procedure for sending a body home, and no one with the authority to invent one. One night, in the 3rd year, Wei Liang sits outside the barracks in the dark and looks at the fires on the watchtowers. Not his section's towers. Those are still being built. The towers to the east, already standing, fires burning at their heads against the black sky. From this distance, they look like the most peaceful things in the world. Small, warm, steady. Like someone has lit candles for a reason that has nothing to do with the gold, the mountain, or the work. He sits there for a while, watching the fires burn, and does not think about anything in particular. This is the first time tonight that the fire finds us. Remember where you left it. In the end, Wei Liang moved the stones, carefully, with his full body weight, with the unhurried precision of a man who has learned that rushing this kind of work costs more in recovery time than it saves. The wall rose behind him, stone by stone, in the mountain air, and every stone had a man behind it who will not be named in any official record of what was built. Let's not forget that a wall is also a gate. The Qin dynasty lasts 15 years after the first emperor's death. It collapses under the weight of rebellion and administrative overreach with a speed that genuinely surprised everyone, including the people who had been unhappy with it, who had expected it to take at least a generation to fall. The Han Dynasty arrives in 202 BCE and inherits the wall the way you inherit a difficult piece of family property, with complicated feelings and a maintenance backlog that is immediately daunting. The Qin Wall, built at tremendous speed on terrain that was not universally cooperative, has already begun to deteriorate in places. Han engineers survey it, wince in the professional way of people evaluating someone else's work, and begin a 400-year project of repair and westward extension. The westward extension matters. It creates the Hexi Corridor, a long, narrow, defensible strip of land connecting central China to the routes of Central Asia. And into this corridor, almost immediately, flows the thing that will define the Han period's relationship with the outside world, the Silk Road. You are at a gate in the Han Wall, west of the Yellow River, and the world is passing through it. Silk going west, quantities of it that still seem extraordinary, entire caravans, bolts of fabric stacked on two humped camels that are expressing their reservations about the altitude in the particular expressive way that camels have. Coming east, jade, glass, lapis lazuli, the occasional piece of Roman glassware that has survived a journey that involved 6 languages and 4 mountain ranges. There's paper, which China has, and the Mediterranean does not yet. There's iron. There's a Sogdian merchant from what is now Uzbekistan, who has been traveling for 4 months and has strong views about the quality of the tea at this particular gate, which he is communicating through increasingly elaborate gestures, because no one here speaks Sogdian. And the gate official has the expression of a man who has decided that I understand you have concerns, is an adequate diplomatic response to most things. The gate system is a work of administrative precision. Every caravan is documented, name, origin, destination, goods carried, taxes assessed, passes issued. The bamboo strips recording these transactions, fragments of which have been found by archaeologists in the dry air of Gansu 2,000 years later, still legible, are models of bureaucratic detail. The ancient world's customs house, run by officials who had probably never been further west than Dunhuang, and were nonetheless expected to evaluate the provenance of Parthian silver and the quality of Central Asian jade. But the gate was also a theater of farewell. And this is the thing the official records don't capture. There is a custom, developed at the westernmost gates of the Han Wall, by which travelers departing for Central Asia throw a stone against the wall as they pass through. If the stone bounces back, it means they will return. If it falls, and it usually falls, the wall does not bounce things back with any reliability. Then, well, you think about it for a moment, and then you continue walking west, because the road is long, and the alternative is to stand at the gate indefinitely, throwing stones. Near one of the western gates, a woman named Shu Li Hong operates a small tea stand between two supply buildings, in a gap that the official layout of the garrison has never quite decided what to do with. She is the daughter of a gate official, widowed at 31, and she has found that travelers who have been on the road for 3 months will pay a reasonable price for a cup of tea and 15 minutes of not being in transit. Her tea is not special. Her location is everything. In 15 years of operation, she will hear stories from 8 different empires, pick up fragments of 12 languages, and accumulate a detailed working knowledge of Central Asian trade routes, political situations, and road conditions that no imperial survey would ever think to record, because she is not the kind of person that official surveys record. The Meng Jiangnu story is already circulating among the laborers and the travelers and the gate officials in various forms by the mid-Han period. It is the story of a woman whose husband was conscripted to build the original Qin wall, who waited for years and then walked north to find him, and who learned that he had died in the construction. His body worked into the wall itself, and who wept with such force that a section of the wall collapsed and gave her back his bones. In some versions, the emperor becomes involved. In all versions, the woman's grief is the most powerful force in the story, stronger than the imperial project, stronger than the architecture, stronger than the wall. The story is not, in the strict historical sense, true, but it is told in the right language for the thing it describes. And in the years of the Han, when the wall is being extended and maintained by men, the system will not allow to come home. the story circulates like a comfort and an accusation simultaneously. Someone is keeping count. Someone will weep hard enough eventually to knock it down. On a still night in late autumn, along the Han Wall's western extension, the beacon fires burn their sequence from tower to tower in the darkness. One fire for a force of 100, 2 for 500, 3 for 1,000 men approaching, 4 for 5,000. The code is elegant, the system is well drilled, and the fires burn whether there is an enemy coming or not, because fire is the nervous system of the wall, and the nervous system has to keep working even in the quiet months, even when the only thing watching it is the sky. The second time the fire finds us tonight is here. A single guard on a tower of the western extension in the late Han period, watching the fire he lit at dusk and will tend until morning. No smoke rising from the steppe, no enemy count to signal, just the fire burning against the cold, and the stars overhead, and the road west running into the dark beyond the gate. Shu Li Hong has banked her fire for the night. The last caravan is settled in the courtyard south of the wall. The camels have gone quiet. The stars over the Gobi Desert are unreasonably beautiful, the Milky Way fully visible, horizon to horizon, impersonal and enormous, indifferent to walls and gates and the administrative processing of luxury goods. There will be a time to come back to this gate. For now, the fire burns and the night holds. Let's be clear about what life on the wall actually looked like. You are Chen Mingji. You have been stationed at the watchtower your crew calls Wushan 5 Mountains for 8 years of a 12-year posting. In 8 years on a military frontier, you have been involved in no military action. Not once. This is, by the standards of garrison life on the Han Wall, entirely normal, and perhaps even desirable, though in the first years it felt like an extended administrative misunderstanding that would surely be corrected. What you have experienced in lieu of battle is this: 3 men falling from the wall, 2 in ice storms, 1 in a wind of such personal conviction that it seemed to have a specific objection to people standing in elevated positions. You have experienced one sergeant going quietly and comprehensively mad from the isolation, which manifested first as talking to himself, then as talking to the wall, and finally as conducting long and apparently satisfying conversations with a particular stone in the north-facing parapet that he had named Brother Zhang, and which the rest of the crew found more endearing than alarming by the time it reached its full expression. You have experienced the arrival of a supply cart 3 weeks late, during which the mood in the garrison fell from stoic to apocalyptic, and then, when the cart finally came, rose to something approaching ecstasy over dried fish. The human capacity for finding joy in the ordinary is most visible, Chen Mingji has learned, in conditions where the ordinary has been withheld for a while. The daily routine at Wushan is not inspiring. Morning watch from first light until the sun clears the ridgeline, roughly 2 hours, varying by season. Then, inspection of the wall face for structural damage, which the weather continuously provides, and which is documented in reports that go to the garrison commander, who sends them to the regional administration, who presumably does something with them, though evidence for this is thin. Then, weapons maintenance, which is technically mandatory and practically cursory by year 4. Then, the middle hours of the day, which belong to gambling, mostly. Dice games of such long duration that the running tallies have become essentially theoretical. The money, long since redistributed through so many rounds that its current location is a philosophical question more than a financial one. Then, afternoon watch. Then dinner preparation, which falls to old Pang, the cook, who is approximately the age of the wall and has opinions about millet soup that he will share unprompted and at length. Old Pang has been on the wall for 22 years. He has never discussed his reasons for this. He is, in all observable respects, content. He grows a small garden of medicinal herbs in the crevice between the garrison building and the south face of the wall. And in the late summer, the herbs give the garrison a particular smell, something between a pharmacy and a kitchen, that Chen Mingji has come to associate with the brief period of each year when the north is almost pleasant. Other men grow things too. This is the detail about the Great Wall that no history book mentions, because it fits none of the available narratives of the wall, neither heroism nor atrocity, neither monument nor ruin. Garrison soldiers across the centuries of the wall's operation grew small gardens in the cracks. Bean plants, onions, struggling patches of garlic, the occasional herb. No one ordered it. No one recorded it. The wall lived in and worked in over generations, acquired a domestic texture, cooking fires, laundry hanging between parapet stones, the small botanical rebellions of people trying to make a permanent home in a place they were assigned. Chen Mingji's home, or the place he thinks of as home when he can no longer stop himself from thinking about it, is 3 weeks' ride south. A village in Hebei province, a mother who still worries about him, a younger brother who has probably grown taller by now, and who Chen Mingji has not seen in 4 years. There was a letter 6 months ago, written in his mother's careful hand. She is well. The harvest was adequate. His brother has taken a wife. His father's back still troubles him. She misses him. The letter has been read enough times that the paper is developing structural concerns. He has started to memorize sections in case it finally gives out. The view from Wushan is extraordinary. This is something the military dispatches and the supply manifests and the administrative correspondence about garrison numbers never mentions. The Great Wall was built frequently in places of savage and unreasonable beauty. The mountain ridges north of the Yellow River bend are spectacular in all seasons. In summer, green and vertical. In winter, white and absolute. In autumn, the color of old bronze and fire, the kind of landscape that you suspect was designed by someone showing off. The wall runs along the ridgeline, rising and falling with the terrain. And in the early morning, with mist filling the valleys, it looks like something from a painting that a scholar has made of these same mountains from very far away and in much greater comfort. Chen Mingji has learned over 8 years to see the view. This is a skill, not a given. In the first year, the view was backdrop. He had the posting to adjust to, the social geometry of garrison life to navigate, the simple daily logistics of survival in a cold place to organize. But sometime in the 3rd year, watching the dawn come across the steppe in a particular light that he couldn't describe with any precision, except that it was so enormous and so indifferent that something inside him stopped fighting it. He arrived at something he could only call peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, something quieter. The peace of a person who has stopped arguing with the size of the world. The fire burns every night on the Wushan Tower. Chen Mingji lights it at dusk and tends it until dawn. No alarm tonight, no signal to send, just the fire doing what fire does, burning against the cold, turning the black sky a deeper black by contrast, keeping its small circle of warmth against the large and indifferent dark. This is the third time the fire finds us tonight. It finds us here, on the ridge, in the hands of a man who has been watching it for 8 years, and who knows, in the wordless way that frontier soldiers sometimes know things they've never been taught, that the fire is not just a signal, it is a promise. As long as it burns, someone is here. As long as someone is here, the line holds. He reads his mother's letter again, in the fire's light. Let's talk about what the wall made possible. The gate at Jiayuguan, the westernmost fortified point of the Han Wall's extension, where the fortification meets the Gobi and the Taklamakan beyond it, is where China ends and the world begins, officially, and has been since the 2nd century BCE. The desert stretches west from the gate in 3 directions, each one worse than the last. To the northwest, the Taklamakan, whose name means, in the Uyghur language, approximately, you go in and you don't come out, which is more honest tourism marketing than most places manage. To the north, the Gobi. To the west, the Silk Road, which runs through all of this anyway, because the merchants of the ancient world were willing to negotiate with geography in ways that modern logistics planners would find admirable and exhausting. The gate itself is a work of layered architecture: outer wall, middle gate, inner gate, administrative courtyard, supply depot, garrison barracks, multiple layers of processing to pass through, which functions as a customs procedure, and also, not incidentally, as a physical demonstration of the seriousness of the boundary. Getting into China takes effort. Getting out of China takes effort. This is, in the ancient world, a feature rather than a bug. The administrative records kept at these western gates, fragments of which survive on bamboo strips found in the dry air of the Dunhuang region, preserved by a climate that is terrible for human life and excellent for organic materials, are remarkable documents. Name, point of origin, destination, goods carried, tax assessed, pass issued. The scribe who recorded a Sogdian merchant's jade inventory on a winter day in 100 BC. He had no idea his paperwork would outlast his dynasty, his empire, his language, and most of the geography it described. He was just doing his job, with the careful penmanship of a man who has been told that careless paperwork has consequences. The custom of throwing a stone against the wall before departing westward has deepened by the Tang period into something resembling ritual. Travelers carve their names on the wall near the gate, elegies to themselves, pre-written, just in case. Some of these carvings are still visible. Most are not. The wall, over 2 millennia, has been covered with the names of people who were leaving and wanted, in some wordless way, to leave something that wasn't them behind. Shu Li Hong, who has now been operating her tea stand near the gate for 15 years, long enough to have become unofficial institutional memory for caravan traders on the Silk Road's Chinese terminus, watches travelers carve their names and throw their stones with the same steady attention she gives the weather. She has seen hundreds of people do it. She has seen some of them come back. She has seen most of them not. The wall provides no information on which category any given traveler will occupy. It just stands there, patient and non-committal, collecting names. Her tea is still not special. Her knowledge of Central Asian political conditions, road quality, recommended guest houses, dangerous passes, corrupt local officials, and the going rate for silk in 6 markets is extraordinary. The merchants who have been trading this route for years know to find her and to spend an extra hour with their tea and to ask their questions quietly, because the information that Shu Li Hong holds in her ordinary-looking head is worth considerably more than what she charges for the cup. She has never crossed the gate herself. She was born east of it, and she will die east of it. And the world that lies to the west of the wall is, for her, a geography made entirely of the testimonies of other people. She has been to 100 places she has never been. She has seen 100 things she has never seen. The wall, in this sense, gives her the world in pieces, filtered through the mouths of people who passed through it, and she has spent 15 years assembling those pieces into something like a map. Meanwhile, in the hills to the east, Chen Mingji is watching his fire, and somewhere south of Shandong, in a village that has adjusted to the long absence of its men, Liu is planting millet for the 4th consecutive spring, calculating what the harvest needs to cover, feeding 2 children on the mathematics of the possible, making it work. And the wall stands between all of them, and connects all of them, and means something different to every one of them, and is indifferent to all of it. Now, let's talk about what happens when no one is in charge. Between the Han and the Tang, roughly 220 CE to 618 CE, China fragments. The 3 kingdoms. The Western Jin. The period of the 16 kingdoms. The Northern and Southern dynasties. 400 years in which the political unity that the Qin and Han had achieved by extraordinary effort and extraordinary cost simply stops holding, and the north of China passes through the hands of a succession of powers, some of Chinese origin, some of nomadic origin, some of a genuinely complicated mixture of both that defies any clean categorization. During this period, the wall mostly sleeps. This is something the popular story of the Great Wall leaves out almost entirely. The wall was never one continuous project. It was not built and then maintained. It was built in bursts of imperial ambition, maintained while the ambition lasted, and abandoned when it didn't. During the centuries of division, with shifting frontiers and unstable polities, the rammed earth sections of the Qin and early Han wall crumble. The timber in the watchtowers rots. The garrisons are withdrawn or simply stop being paid, which in practice comes to the same thing. Vegetation takes root in the cracks. Farmers on both sides of the increasingly theoretical line begin to treat the wall as a quarry, already broken to useful shapes, the right kind of stone already cut and accessible, perfect for farmhouse foundations and village boundary walls and the linings of irrigation channels. The wall, which was built from the landscape, begins to return to it. This is the honest biography of every large structure. It requires continuous investment in the belief that it is still worth maintaining. When that belief fades, the structure fades with it. The Qin Wall was built on the belief that a unified China needed a definitive northern border, and when the Qin dynasty's confidence in its own survival collapsed, the wall's maintenance collapsed with it. The Han Wall was built on a similar belief, sustained for 4 centuries, and then that belief also ran out. The Tang dynasty, arriving in 618 with the energy of a dynasty that had recently won a civil war and was in the mood to expand rather than contract, looked at the state of the northern fortifications and made a decision. They weren't going to rebuild them. The Tang strategy was not the wall strategy. It was the cavalry strategy. Push outward. Incorporate the steppe peoples into the Tang military as allies and administrators. Use mobility rather than fixed defense to manage the frontier. This worked brilliantly for about a century and a half, until the An Lushan rebellion of 755 exposed how thoroughly the Tang had overextended, and the dynasty spent the next 150 years slowly contracting toward a smaller, more cautious version of itself. But the Tang period gave China something important in the absence of the wall. A period of genuine cosmopolitan openness, when the northern frontier was a zone of exchange rather than a line of exclusion. When Sogdian merchants and Uyghur traders and Tibetan pilgrims and Japanese students moved through the Tang Empire with a freedom that no other Chinese dynasty would replicate. The wall represents one theory of the frontier: contain and control. The Tang represents another: engage and incorporate. Both theories produced remarkable results. Both theories also produced catastrophic failures. The history of the Chinese frontier is, in some ways, the history of this argument, carried on across 2,000 years of dynasties, in the language of stone and cavalry and silk and fire. The song, arriving in 960, looked north at the Khitan Liao and felt the old anxiety return. The argument swung back toward stone, and the wall, dormant, began to be considered again. Here is a piece of history the popular story tends to quietly omit. It was not only Chinese dynasties that built walls on the northern frontier. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, which had absorbed the Khitan Liao, and then, in 1127, pushed the Song entirely south of the Huai River, began constructing their own fortification line in the mid-12th century. Not south-facing, against the Chinese they had already conquered. North-facing, against the Mongols they had begun to fear. The Jin Wall, sometimes called the Jin Boundary Trench or the Jin Defensive Line, stretched in segments across the Mongolian plateau and the highlands of Manchuria. Over 1,000 miles of it, still traceable today in satellite photographs of the inner Mongolian grasslands. The Jurchen were a people who had, within living memory, been precisely the kind of northern cavalry force that walls were built against. A generation of successful conquest had given them cities, an agricultural tax base, a civil service, and a northern frontier of their own. Standing at that frontier and looking north toward the steppe, they felt the ancient logic of their former adversaries make sudden and complete sense from the other direction. The Mongols went through the Jin Wall as they went through everything else. Walls do not stop the determined. They slow the undetermined and make the approach of the determined visible, which is, in the end, all a wall ever honestly promises. But the fact that the Jurchen built one at all is worth sitting with. The impulse to draw a line and give it physical weight does not belong to any one civilization. It belongs to every civilization that has ever found itself with a frontier and something on the other side of it that it couldn't fully name. Let's start with what you're actually looking at. When a person stands on the Great Wall, at Badaling, say, or Mutianyu, or any of the famous photographed sections north of Beijing, and feels the weight of it, the age of it, the way it runs along the mountain ridge with the confidence of something that belongs there. What they are standing on is mostly Ming. This surprises people. The Great Wall of the photographs, of the textbooks, of the film stills, and the tourist brochures, and the section that astronauts definitely cannot see from space, but like to be asked about, the one made of dressed stone and fired brick, with properly proportioned watchtowers and wide patrol paths on top, and those distinctive arched doorways, is not primarily the wall Qin Shu Huang. It is not primarily the wall of the Han. It is the reconstruction of the Ming Dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644, and which spent a very large portion of that time convinced, not unreasonably, that the northern frontier required urgent attention. The man most responsible for the wall you actually see is General Qi Jiguang, and he deserves considerably more fame outside China than he currently has. Qi Jiguang was appointed commander of the Jiliao Corridor in 1567, at the age of 40. He was already famous. He had spent the previous decade fighting Japanese pirates, woku, on China's southeastern coast, with a tactical creativity and administrative competence that made him something of a legend in his own lifetime. He arrived at the northern wall with the experience of a commander who had thought carefully about the relationship between terrain, fortification, and mobile defense, and with the disposition of a person who finds sloppiness genuinely offensive. What he found in the north was not encouraging. The existing fortifications were inconsistent to the point of being incoherent. Some sections solid, some crumbling, some that appeared to have been built at different historical periods by people who had not communicated with each other about the design standards. The watchtowers varied in height, structure, and integrity in ways that suggested they had been built by whatever combination of materials and labor happened to be available at the time, which was accurate. The garrison troops were undertrained, underpaid, and had developed a finely calibrated understanding of how to appear occupied without doing anything that would attract either combat or official scrutiny. Qi Jiguang spent the next 15 years building the wall he needed. The hollow towers, the ones you see in every photograph, with their enclosed upper stories and their internal staircases and their arched windows, are largely his innovation. Previous towers had been solid platforms, places to stand and look from. Qi's towers were places to live and fight from, habitable, with internal ammunition, storage, sleeping quarters for a small garrison, ground floor rooms for supplies and weapons. A tower with men and materials in it could hold a position against a larger force long enough for reinforcement to arrive. A tower that was just a pile of shaped stone could not. He standardized the wall's dimensions, typically 7.8 meters high at the parapet, 6.5 meters wide at the base, tapering to 5.8 at the top, wide enough for 5 horses to ride abreast, which was the operational requirement for moving troops quickly along the wall's top in response to an incursion. He built or rebuilt over 1,200 watchtowers in the Jiliao sector alone. He upgraded the signaling system, increased garrison pay, a revolutionary intervention, it turned out, for retention, and introduced a training regimen that reflected how warfare was actually being conducted, rather than how it had been conducted in the dynasty's first, more confident century. He also wrote extensively military treatises, training manuals, tactical analyses. The Jixiao Qinshu, New Book of Effective Discipline, remains one of the most thorough military texts in Chinese history, studied by commanders for 2 centuries after his death. He was a complete soldier in the classical sense, tactician, engineer, administrator, writer. He built the best wall China ever had, and documented exactly how he did it, and then watched the court politics that have always surrounded successful generals close in around him in his old age. He died in 1588, having seen his principal patron die and his enemies successfully petition for his cashiering from command. He left behind a wall. The wall faced north. It was designed for the Altan Khan and the Mongol threat of the mid-Ming period. It was not going to stop an invasion definitively. Both Qi Jiguang and the court knew this. But it was going to make incursion expensive, channel large forces into predictable corridors, and create conditions where a Chinese response could be organized. It was going to do what walls do well, not absolute prevention, but controlled friction, making the easy approach visible and the visible approach costly. It is, by every standard of military engineering, magnificent. It is also going to fall to a man who opens a gate. The rest of this story needs to be told differently. We have been moving at some pace through centuries and dynasties and engineering decisions, and we will return to those. But there is a dimension of this history that does not belong to the men with titles. And before we reach the part of the story where the wall finally fails in the way it was always going to fail, we need to go back to what the wall cost. Let's go back to Meng Jiangnu. Her story is not history. It is legend, which is to say, it is history processed through the feelings of the people it happened to, which is sometimes the more honest document. The core of it is this. Meng Jiangnu's husband, Fan Shiliang, was conscripted for the Qin construction project. He went north. She waited. He did not come back. She walked north to find him carrying warm clothing, which is such an ordinary and heartbreaking detail that it is worth stopping on for a moment. Carrying warm clothing, because she knew it would be cold where he was, and she wanted to bring him something warm. She reached the wall. She learned that Fan Shiliang had died in the construction, and that his body, like the bodies of so many men who died working on the northern fortifications, had simply been incorporated into the fill because there was no provision for returning the dead, no procedure for identifying and separating remains from the material of the wall itself, no official who had been assigned the task of caring about the difference. The wall needed fill. The dead were available. In the brutal arithmetic of the Qin construction system, the calculation was complete. Meng Jiangnu wept for 49 days, and in the legend, a section of the wall collapsed and gave back her husband's bones. Whether the story is literally true is, in the scholarly consensus, a question whose answer is no. Whether it names something true is not in question at all. The legend accumulated around the wall because the wall was the right shape for it, because there were real people like Meng Jiangnu, thousands of them, tens of thousands, women who walked north with warm clothing and were told that their husbands were in the wall now, that the wall had taken them, and the wall did not give things back, that there was no procedure for this, that they should return home. The legend is the formal grief of all of those returns. It is the story the culture told itself in order to have somewhere to put the feeling that the official record was not designed to hold. In the various later forms of the story, Meng Jiangnu is summoned before the emperor, who intends to punish her for disrupting an imperial construction project with her tears, and is instead so struck by her beauty that he proposes to make her a concubine. She agrees, contingently. She demands a proper burial for Fan Shiliang, 49 days of official mourning, a procession of ministers in formal dress to honor his grave. The emperor, dazzled beyond prudence, agrees to all of it. When the 49 days are over, Meng Jiangnu throws herself into the sea. She gets the funeral. She gets the grief witnessed by power. She does not get Fan Xiliang back. No legend, however good, can give that. And yet, this is the thing that makes the story endure. She walked north with the warm clothes. She did the thing that love makes you do. The thing that is clearly going to be insufficient to the situation, and which is done anyway. Because what are you going to do instead? Stand at home and know that he is in the wall, somewhere, unnamed and unrecorded, and do nothing? That was not the option that Meng Jiangnu's love gave her. The wall stands in the northern mountains, patient and cold. And somewhere in it, in every version of it, Qin and Han and Ming, in every stone placed by a man who was not asked whether he wanted to be there, is the unresolved grief of the people who built it and the people who waited for them to come back. Not metaphorically, literally. The grief is in the stones, in the mortar, in the 2,000 years of maintenance and neglect and restoration that have kept the wall standing. It is in there the way something is in something when it has been built in. The warm clothes are still in the legend. The wall still has no procedure for giving anything back. Let's be honest about something. The Great Wall, across its entire history, was breached, bypassed, bribed through, circumvented by negotiation, or simply made irrelevant by the mobile intelligence of the people it was meant to stop on so many occasions, that calling it a successful defensive structure requires a definition of success so charitable it borders on fiction. The Xiongnu were not permanently stopped by the Qin or Han fortifications. They were deterred intermittently, paid off regularly, and occasionally defeated in the field by military campaigns that operated beyond the wall's protection rather than behind it. The Han peace with the Xiongnu came, eventually, not from the wall, but from a combination of persistent military pressure, the strategic marriages known as Heikin, and the Xiongnu's own internal political fragmentation. A civil conflict that produced a split into northern and southern branches, the southern of which submitted to Han authority on its own terms. The wall was involved in none of this. The Tang, as we have noted, did not particularly need the wall and did not maintain it. Their frontier strategy was projection rather than containment, and for the period of Tang confidence, it worked. When it stopped working, the problem was not the absence of a wall. It was the internal collapse of a dynasty that had overextended in ways a wall could not have prevented. The Mongols are the wall's most famous failure, and they are worth dwelling on, because the failure is instructive in ways that go beyond the simple military fact of it. Genghis Khan and his successors did not storm the wall in the cinematic sense, cavalry cresting the battlements, arrows in the air. The Mongols breached, circumvented, or negotiated through the wall repeatedly in a variety of ways. They went through gates opened by bribery. They went through gaps in coverage where the garrison was too thin to hold the line. They exploited the periods of internal conflict in the Jin and Song dynasties, when Chinese commanders were more concerned with each other than with the northern frontier. By 1215, Beijing had fallen. By 1279, the Mongol Yuan dynasty governed all of China. The wall during the Yuan period was simply interior geography, a feature of the landscape rather than a national border. And then the Ming built the best wall in Chinese history, and the Ming fell through an opened gate. It is 1644. The Chongzhen emperor has hanged himself on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City as rebel forces enter Beijing. The Ming dynasty, nearly 300 years old, is ending in the most undignified possible way. Not conquered exactly, but collapsing, eaten from the inside by rebellion and fiscal crisis and the decade-long famines and floods that had undermined public confidence in imperial governance more thoroughly than any foreign army could have managed. At the Shanhai Pass, the crucial eastern junction where the Great Wall meets the sea, the most fortified point in the entire fortification system, the Ming general Wu Sangui is holding his position between two sets of enemies. The rebel forces of Li Zicheng are to his west. The Manchu Qing forces are to his north and east. Both have sent him messages. Both have made him offers. He is holding the most important gate in China, and he has a decision to make. He opens the gate. The Qing enter through Shanghai Pass, through the most fortified point on the most expensive wall China ever built, because the man standing at the gate decided to let them in. And the wall, 2,000 miles of it, built by hundreds of thousands of hands across multiple dynasties, renovated by Qi Jiguang at the cost of 15 years of his working life, maintained by generations of garrison soldiers who grew beans in the cracks and read their letters until the paper gave out, was, in the end, precisely as strong as the weakest point of human loyalty in its defense. This is the lesson that every wall eventually teaches. A wall does not protect you from the person on your side who decides to open it. It is the most obvious thing in the world, stated plainly. It is also the thing that every wall builder forgets or refuses to believe until the moment when it becomes undeniable. Let's not forget the fires, the beacon fire system, the wall's nervous system, the ancient data network, the string of lights running east and west across the northern mountains for 2,000 years, had its own history of failures, and the failures were not only technical. The fires could be lit for the wrong reason. A guard who saw shadows on the steppe and panicked. A junior officer who mistook a dust cloud from a herd of animals for the advance of an army. False alarms that sent garrison forces mobilizing unnecessarily, burned through response capacity, and, over time, eroded the credibility of the signal itself. The more false alarms in a given year, the more a commanding officer developed the habit of wanting confirmation before committing his force, which meant that the first response to a genuine alarm was delay, which was the thing the system had been designed to prevent. The fires could also simply fail to be lit. A guard bribed to look the other way. A guard who fell asleep not through laziness, but through the genuine physical collapse of a person who has been standing watch for 5 consecutive hours on a cold mountain, who has been doing this for 8 years, who has not been in combat once, and whose body has been patiently making the case that maybe tonight, just tonight, the steppe is probably quiet. A guard who was eliminated before he could signal. A scenario that the signal system was not designed to account for, because if the guard is already dead, The question of whether he lit the fire has become academic. By the Ming period, the system had been formalized to a degree its creators would not have recognized. 5 levels of signal. 1 fire and 1 cannon shot for 100 men approaching. 2 fires and 2 cannon shots for 500. 3 fires and 3 shots for 1,000. 4 fires and 4 shots for 5,000. 5 fires and 5 shots for more than 10,000. Clear, unambiguous, elegant on paper. In practice, dependent on every station in the chain being staffed, awake, uncompromised, and correctly supplied with the materials to both make fire and fire a cannon. The chain is only as strong as its most tired, most cold, most underpaid, most isolated link. There is also the question of what happens to a signal system under extended conditions of relative quiet. The early Ming had faced genuine and repeated Mongol incursions that kept the beacon network functioning as designed, used regularly, tested by actual events, reliable in the way that systems are reliable when they have to work. But the more effective periods of wall policy created stretches of deterred stability in certain sectors. Not the peace of a solved problem, but the quiet of a discouraged one. And in a discouraged sector, the alarm fires don't fire. The cannon don't discharge. Year after year, the watchtower crews stand their rotations, and the steppe stays quiet. And the machinery of alertness begins to corrode in the way that machinery corrodes when no one loads it. Not broken, not formally abandoned, just very slightly less trustworthy than the training doctrine assumes, because doctrine is written at headquarters by people who have never stood 8 years of watch in a stone tower on a cold ridge without once needing to fire a shot. The gap between what a system is designed to do and what the people inside it believe they will ever actually need to do is one of the oldest and most predictable failure modes in military history. The Ming signal network had it. Every signal network has it. You cannot entirely solve it. You can only hope the gap doesn't widen to exactly the wrong width on exactly the wrong night. The Tumu crisis of 1449 is the most spectacular single demonstration of what happens when the wall system and the dynasty's confidence fail simultaneously. the Zhengtong Emperor, 22 years old, in the grip of a favorite eunuch official's disastrous military advice, marched beyond the wall on a campaign against the Mongol leader Esen Taisi, with an army of 500,000 men and grossly inadequate provisions. The campaign was poorly planned, poorly supplied, and poorly commanded. The emperor was captured at the Battle of Tumu Fortress, the actual emperor of China in person. The system designed to project power and protect the frontier had, in a single campaign, delivered its emperor into captivity. The wall was not consulted about any of this. And yet, on a night somewhere in the middle of the Ming Dynasty's long existence, not a crisis night, not a famous night, on an ordinary watchtower, on an ordinary ridge, the fire burns. Chen Mingji is asleep in this century. His posting ended 30 years ago. But someone else is standing watch tonight, and the fire is burning, and no enemy signal is called for, and the guard has stopped looking at the dark because the dark is quiet, and instead he is watching the fire itself. The way it moves, the way the wind shifts the flame without killing it, the way it gives off a heat you can feel only if you are close enough. Not enough heat to warm the whole mountain, but enough to warm the man who is standing next to it. He doesn't dream of the Mongols. He dreams of home. The fire burns through the night. It signals nothing. It answers nothing. It is just warm in a cold place, which is the oldest and most honest thing a fire can be. Now, let's talk about something smaller. Let's come back, finally, to Wei Liang. Not the facts of his labor. We've covered those. Not the history of the dynasty he was conscripted by. Something smaller and more true. It is the 5th year of Wei Liang's posting to the construction project, and he is 31 years old, which means he is old enough to feel the work in his back in the mornings, and young enough to keep not mentioning it. The section of wall he has been working is nearly complete. The main rampart at final height, the crenellations being set, the watchtower at the east end halfway up. Wei Liang is still on the stone-cutting crew. He has been cutting stone for 5 years. He does it now with the particular quality of a practiced person, unhurried, precise, the motion coming from somewhere below conscious decision. He has a colleague, a man from Hebei province, whose village nickname is Crane. He has very long legs and an expression of perpetual mild surprise, which is either a feature of his face or a response to the last 5 years. In the evenings, Crane tells stories. Not official stories. Not the story about why the wall is necessary and why serving the emperor is the highest thing a person can do. Real stories about a market day that ended in a fight over the price of a pig, about a magistrate so comprehensively corrupt that even the other magistrates spoke about him in hushed tones, about a harvest festival from a particularly good year 15 years ago, when for 3 entire days everyone in the village was happy for no reason anyone could name. And the fact that those 3 days should stand out with such clarity from all the other days is something Crane finds genuinely strange and worth discussing at length. Wei Liang listens. He does not tell many stories. He is not, by nature, a storyteller. But he is an excellent listener, which is a skill that does not appear in any document, and which is, in the long history of what makes human communities survivable, probably more important than most of what does. One evening, some weeks before the section is scheduled to complete, and the crew to disperse to other projects, or, in theory, to be released, though Wei Liang has long since stopped treating in theory and in practice as the same kind of statement. He finishes cutting a large section of granite, and before fitting it in place, does something he cannot entirely explain. With the blunt corner of a worn chisel barely scratching the surface, he makes a small diagonal mark on the stone's underface. Not a character, not a name. The beginning of something, or the end of something, without enough to it to be clearly either. As if someone started to write something and then stopped, not because they had nothing to say, but because stone was never quite the right medium for saying it. He places the stone in the wall. He doesn't think about it again. Somewhere in Hebei province, on a restoration project in the early 21st century, a team of archaeologists excavating a flood-damaged section of Ming wall discovers a piece of granite with a faint diagonal scratch on its interior face. It is catalogued as S4471. Possible tool mark, the notes read. The stone is photographed, documented, and replaced in the wall. The archaeologists move on to the next stone. Wei Liang's village adapted to his absence the way villages adapt to loss. Imperfectly, but practically. Liu remarried in the 4th year, a widower from the next village. A steady man, someone who would keep the children fed and the farm running. Someone who understood that the mathematics of survival in a conscription year could not wait for sentiment to finish its business. This was not a betrayal. This was what survival looks like when the empire's needs and the family's needs are not the same calendar. The boy Bao grew up and had children. The girl Mei grew up and had children. 2,000 years later, someone who might be descended from that line is living somewhere in Shandong, farming or not farming, with no particular knowledge that an ancestor of theirs once cut stone for a wall that is now a World Heritage Site and costs the equivalent of 20 yuan to enter. The stone is still there. That's the thing about stones. The empires collapse, the dynasties get revised, the generals get named and renamed in the history books. The postcard changes its design to reflect the current preferred angle. But the stone stays, doing its holding its position in the wall with the perfect, uncomplaining patience that is the specific and exclusive achievement of stone. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in that. Let's talk about the people who don't appear in this story. This is important, and it tends to get left out. So let's state it clearly and not move past it too quickly. The corvée system that built the Qin and Han walls, and the military service system that staffed the garrisons of every dynasty afterward, removed men from their families and communities for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes permanently. And the families they left behind, the wives, the parents, the children who grew up waiting, did not stop functioning because the men were gone. The farm did not stop being a farm because the man who worked it had been called north. The tax collector did not stop coming. The seasons did not accommodate the absence. What the women of northern China's border provinces did across the centuries of wall building and wall maintenance was carry everything that the official history of the wall describes as the supporting economy, and which is more accurately described as life. They ran the farms. They managed the household accounts, deciding what to sell, when to borrow, what to plant in a dry year versus a wet one. They maintained the community relationships, the reciprocities, the obligations, the networks of mutual aid between families that allow a village to survive a bad harvest or an epidemic or a year when too many of its working age men are constructing a northern fortification. Liu planted millet. This is not a metaphor. She literally planted millet, 4 seasons in succession, with 2 children at her feet, and a village that had lost a significant fraction of its working age men to the same conscription order, which meant that the women who remained were running an agricultural operation designed for twice the labor force with half of it. They made it work. Not easily. Not without cost. Not without seasons when the calculation came up short and someone went hungry. And the choices made to prevent that were not the kinds of choices a person makes without consequence. But they made it work. The woman who kept the farm running while her husband cut stone in the north is not in the legend. The legend has Meng Jiangnu, who is celebrated for weeping hard enough to bring down a section of it. The legend does not have the woman who planted 3 seasons of millet and raised 2 children and managed the family debt and made 100 quiet decisions that kept a household alive while the empire used her husband for something else. That story is not legendary. It is ordinary. It was the story of half the families in northern China for 12 centuries. Ordinary does not mean unimportant. In the architecture of what the wall required in order to exist, not just the stones and the mortar, not just the garrison and the signal fires, but the entire human infrastructure that sustained the people who built and staffed it. The ordinary work of the women who kept everything running while the wall was being built was the load-bearing element. The thing so fundamental to the structure that no one pauses to look at it directly. Because pausing to look at it directly would require acknowledging that the monument is not made only of what the monument says it's made of. There are no shrines to the women who kept the farms. There are no legends about the woman who managed 3 bad harvests in a row and still got her children to adulthood. History, to its general discredit, has not been particularly interested in the patience that is required to hold the ordinary world together while the extraordinary world is busy with its monuments. But the patience was there. It was doing its work, and the wall could not have been built without it, in any sense that the word built is really adequate for what the building of it required. In the end, the wall was a collective project in the deepest possible sense. It required not just the labor of the people who placed the stones, but the endurance of the people who waited, and the long, quiet, unrecorded work of everyone who kept the world running while the official project of empire consumed so many of the people who were supposed to be in it. And honestly, that's probably good enough. Not as a tribute, but as a fact. Enough to say it out loud once. To say, they were here too. They were doing the thing. The thing got done in part because of them. We note this. We move on because there are 2,000 years of history still to get through. But we note it. Now, let's talk about what happened after the wall stopped being a wall. The Qing dynasty, which entered through Wu Sanggui's open gate in 1644 and consolidated its rule over China in the following decades, had no strategic interest in maintaining the northern fortifications. They were Manchu, themselves from north of the wall, and they governed both sides of it. The wall, for the Qing, was not a national border. It was a geological feature of the empire's interior, an artifact of previous dynasties' anxieties, a reminder that their predecessors had been sufficiently frightened of people like them to spend 2,000 years building a very long fence. They maintained some sections for administrative or symbolic reasons. They garrisoned some of the major passes, but the massive military investment of the Ming wall system, the tens of thousands of garrison troops, the constant renovation, the watch and signal network stretched across 2,000 miles of ridge, was not continued. The garrisons thinned. The watchtowers acquainted themselves with weather in the way of unheated structures in northern China, thoroughly and without complaint. What the Qing maintained, they maintained for specific reasons. The major mountain passes, Shanhaiguan on the eastern coast, Jiayuguan at the edge of the Gobi, Gubeiku in the mountains north of Beijing, remained significant choke points for trade, migration, and taxation, regardless of which dynasty governed them. Maintaining minimal fortifications at these passes served the Qing's interest in controlling population movement between the settled agricultural interior and the northern grassland zones. The requirement for travel documentation at these crossings, which had been Ming administrative practice, continued under Qing rule, modified in its details, but structurally intact. The wall as bureaucratic checkpoint outlasted the wall as military installation by a considerable margin. The symbolic question was more delicate. The Qing governed a civilization that had, for 2,000 years, defined itself in part against the northern steppe, and the wall was the most legible emblem of that self-definition. A dynasty that formally demolished it would have been making a political statement that the Qing, navigating the permanent tension between their Manchu identity and their Confucian administration of China, were not positioned to make without cost. Better to let it stand, maintained enough to exist, not maintained enough to imply the steppe threat was still the organizing problem of the state. The wall became, under the Qing, neither ruin nor fortress, but something in between, a monument to anxieties that the current government had rendered, from its own perspective, irrelevant. It was left to the mountains to decide what to do with it. The mountains, as usual, were patient. The wall, which had never quite become what its builders hoped, began the process of becoming something else entirely. Western Europe's encounter with the full scale of the wall happened gradually, through the accounts of Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese traders in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Jesuit Matteo Ricci, who reached China in 1583 and spent the remainder of his life there, wrote about the wall with genuine admiration and a notable clarity about what it had and hadn't accomplished. He called it magnificent. He also noted that it had not, in the event, stopped the Mongols. This kind of balanced assessment tends to get edited out of the popular story because popular stories prefer monuments to be straightforwardly victorious. By the 19th century, Western accounts of China had elevated the wall to something approaching the symbolic status it holds now. Proof of Chinese civilization's antiquity. Evidence of an organizational capacity that the Western Orientalist tradition found both admirable and, in its darker corners, slightly threatening. Foreign diplomats made trips to the accessible northern sections. Painters painted it. Travel writers wrote about it in the sweeping register that travel writers deploy when they want to suggest they are seeing something transcendent rather than just a very long and partially ruined earthwork. In 1908, the American travel writer Eliza Ruhamah Skidmore stood on the wall outside Beijing and wrote about it with the reverence usually reserved for cathedrals and waterfalls. She had no knowledge of Wei Liang, or of Chen Mingji, or of Shu Li Hong at her tea stand, or of the women who planted millet for 4 seasons, waiting for men who didn't come back. She saw a monument to human determination, which is not wrong exactly, but it is the version of not wrong that requires leaving out quite a lot about who was determined on whose behalf and what it cost them to be. In 1972, Nixon came to the wall. He stood at Badaling in his gray overcoat in February, in the company of Henry Kissinger and a Chinese delegation and a large number of cameras, and said, as every foreign dignitary has said, because it is genuinely the thing that comes out of your mouth when you're standing there, that it was truly a great wall. He meant it as a compliment, and as a photo opportunity, and as a piece of diplomacy conducted in the language of historical admiration. It worked. The photograph of Nixon on the wall is one of the most reproduced images of 20th century diplomacy, which means that the wall accomplished in 1972 exactly what it had been accomplishing since the Han Dynasty. It provided a backdrop, and it let the people standing in front of it believe they were touching something older and more certain than themselves. Today, the most visited section, Badaling, northwest of Beijing, has a cable car. There are souvenir stands, a food court, guards in uniform, a gift shop, and a queue in high summer that would test the patience of anyone who has ever waited in a line of several hundred people to look at something ancient. Shu Li Hong would understand the commerce at the gate immediately. She might find the cable car impressive. The wall would have no opinion. It has been enduring the presence of people for 2,000 years and has developed what appears to be an extremely effective indifference to what they think of it. Now, let's talk about what the wall really built. Not security, not permanently. The breaches and bypasses and bribes and opened gates are all in the historical record, and the most famous defensive structure in the world was, measured against the purpose it was built for. At best, intermittently effective, and at worst, a very expensive declaration of hope, not wealth. The investment in wall construction across the Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and subsidiary dynasties was vast by any measurement, and its economic returns were indirect at best. The Silk Road traded through the wall's gates, but trade finds its roots regardless of whether a wall exists to funnel it. The wall was the administrator of trade, not its cause. What the wall built was an idea, and ideas, as it turns out, are considerably more durable than stone. The idea is something like China. Not China as a geographical fact. The Yellow River Basin existed before any dynasty. But China as a conceptual unity. A civilization that knows where it begins and ends. A people defined in part by the shared project of drawing and maintaining and debating and sometimes suffering for the line between inside and outside. The wall gave that line a physical form. It made the boundary visible, permanent, and expensive, which is to say, it made the boundary serious, in the way that things you spend 2,000 years building tend to be taken seriously. This is not a simple or entirely clean legacy. The wall as boundary was also the wall as exclusion. And exclusion has a history that runs parallel to the history of achievement, in the same way that the weight of the stones runs parallel to the view from the top of them. The dynasties that built the wall also used the concept of clear inside/outside boundaries to define who belonged and who didn't, who deserved the administration's protection and who was outside its consideration. The people north of the wall were not people to be incorporated, but people to be kept at distance. And that way of thinking had consequences that extended well beyond military policy. And yet, the inside of the wall was a shared space. The people south of the wall, in Shandong and Hebei and Gansu and Henan, in their different dialects and different local food traditions and different regional customs, shared the experience of the wall as a common project, a common sacrifice, a common background. The person from Shandong, who had never been to Gansu, still knew that somewhere in Gansu, someone had contributed to the same wall that his ancestor had contributed to. That is a thin thread of connection, possibly. But in the long history of how diverse populations come to think of themselves as a single people, thin threads have done considerable work. China's relationship with the wall today is complicated in the way that national relationships with national symbols usually are. Part pride, part discomfort, part genuine admiration for the craft, part unresolved conversation about what exactly we're celebrating when we celebrate something built at that cost by people who had no choice about being part of it. Chinese historians are not uniformly celebratory. The Meng Jiangnu story has been in active circulation for 2,000 years, which suggests the culture has never quite managed to file the grief neatly away behind the achievement. That's probably the appropriate response. To hold the two things at once, the wall and what it cost, the view and the stone, the beacon fire and the man who lit it, and the family who waited for him to come home. The wall is still there, patient and gray, and more beautiful than it has any right to be, given what it is. It asks nothing of anyone anymore. It stands in the mountains and receives the weather and lets the tourists come and go and does its one remaining job with complete, unhurried competence. It is there. It has always been there. It will be there for a very long time after everything currently in motion has finished moving. Let's set the scene one final time. It is night on the Great Wall, somewhere in the mountains north of Beijing. The time is unspecified because the mountains at night look much the same whether the year is 100 BCE or 1400 CE or next Tuesday. And what matters right now is not the year, but the quality of the air, which is cold and clear and carries the particular lightness of high places, and the darkness, which is the specific darkness of mountains far from city light. Not oppressive, not threatening, just very large, very honest, and very indifferent to the fact that you are in it. The Milky Way is fully visible. This is something that most people alive today have never seen properly. Not the suggestion of it that you can make out from a lit suburb, but the actual thing, horizon to horizon. Tens of billions of stars in a band of light that has been there since before the mountains existed and will be there long after everything built on them has returned to the earth it came from. The wall runs along the ridge below this sky, rising and falling with the terrain. And in the moonlight, the dressed stone has a silver-gray quality, almost luminescent, the color of something very old that has made its peace with being very old. At the restored sections, Badaling, Mutianyu, Simatai, the great photographed stretches, there are lights now, floodlights for evening tours, the glow of visitor facilities. This is fine. The wall has accommodated considerably more disruptive presences than a gift shop. But further west and further east, in the unrestored sections where the Ming brick has given way to older rammed earth construction, and where the wall is in the process of returning to the landscape, the night is undisturbed. At these sections, the wall makes a different kind of statement than it makes at the tourist spots. A monument says, "Look at what was built." A ruin says, "Look at what endures." And the Great Wall in its ruined sections is not saying what the emperors intended it to say. It is saying something older. The Qin are gone. The Han are gone. The Ming, who built the best version of the wall, are gone. The Xiongnu Confederation dissolved into the long complexity of Central Asian history, and the Mongols no longer govern China, and the Manchu Qing are gone, and Wu Sangui, who opened the gate, is gone. The steppe is still there. The mountains are still there. And the wall is still there, in whatever state it is in, doing the one thing it has always been best at, existing in the landscape with the patient, uncomplaining permanence of stone. The wind comes from the north tonight. It comes down from the Mongolian plateau, as it always has, cold and straightforward, no paperwork, no checkpoints, no interest whatsoever in 2,000 years of fortification policy. It passes through the watchtower windows, through the gaps where the mortar has loosened, through the crenellations and the archers' niches, and the drainage holes built into the parapet to let the rainwater run off the patrol path. The wall does not argue with this. The wall has learned, over 2,000 years, and many dynasties, and several complete cycles of imperial ambition and imperial collapse. That wind is not a military problem. Wind is just the world being itself. Somewhere in a remote section of the wall, far from the tourist infrastructure, a stone that Wei Liang cut in the 3rd year of his posting has been sitting in the same position for 2,200 years. It has been rained on, snowed on, frozen in winter, and dried in summer, briefly buried under a century of erosion, and then uncovered again by a century of wind. The small diagonal mark on its underface, the one he made with the corner of a worn chisel, for reasons he couldn't have explained to himself, is no longer visible, abraded to nothing by time. The stone itself is fine. The stone has what stones always have, an enormous amount of time and an absolute absence of opinion about any of it. And somewhere to the east, in the moonlight, a section of wall that Qi Jiguang rebuilt in the 1570s runs along a ridge above a valley, and the watchtower at its eastern end still stands at the height he specified, and the stairs inside it still lead to the upper story where his garrison soldiers slept. And if you were to climb those stairs tonight and stand at the window and look north across the steppe, you would see the same dark expanse that Chen Mingji watched for 8 years, and the same stars he read his mother's letter by, and the same cold air that carries nothing from the north tonight except itself. No alarm, no enemy signal, just the world being quiet in the way that high and cold places sometimes are, the way that earns those places their particular kind of peace. The fire is out. It has been out for a long time, but the towers are still standing, and the ridge is still there, and the mountains hold the darkness with the same patience they have always had. And somewhere in the warm room where you are, in this century, in this bed that is nothing like a stone garrison, barracks on the edge of the known world, you are very close now to the thing that all of these people were always working toward, the rest at the end of the effort, the warmth at the end of the cold, the dark that is not the dark of the northern steppe, but your own private dark, the one that belongs to you. The stars don't move. The wall doesn't move. The wind from the north has nothing left to say tonight. And the last act of standing watch, in the end, is to hand the dark off to the next person and to let yourself sleep. They carried stone up a mountain. That's the simplest true thing about the Great Wall. And it's the thing the monuments and the postcards and the tourist brochures have the least interest in. Not in triumph, not in service of a meaning they chose or fully understood. In the way that people do necessary things when they have no alternative, because someone with authority said so, and the consequences of refusing were worse. And somewhere south of the cold, a family was waiting. And the body keeps moving when the spirit has run out of reasons. And in the end, stone by stone, in the cold air of the northern plateau, the wall went up. Wei Liang and the tens of thousands of people who worked beside him, whose names are gone, whose faces are gone, who the record never wanted. They were here. They were real. They were cold. They did the thing. And the thing they did is still standing when every dynasty that ordered it has been dust for 20 centuries. That counts for something. It counts for something, even though the wall can't say what, and no one with the power to say it officially ever did. Here is the truth inside all of this. Every generation builds its own version of the wall, not always in stone, in law, in policy, in the structures we raise between what we want to protect and what we're afraid of. And the impulse behind it is not foolish. It is not arrogance most of the time. It is love, mostly. The love of what is on this side of the line, the desperate and very human need to say, here, this is the place where the people I care about are safe, and I will spend whatever I have drawing that boundary and making it visible. The wall didn't hold the Mongols out forever. Nothing holds forever. But the impulse to build it, to go up the mountain and cut the stone and light the fire on the tower against the dark, that impulse is not a mistake. It is one of the oldest things we are. So, as you settle now, as the room closes around you in the dark and the warmth gathers itself into something complete and yours, somewhere in the mountains north of Beijing, on a cold stone ridge under stars that have been there since before any wall existed. The last beacon fire on the last watchtower has burned down to its coals. It gives off no alarm. It calls no army. It is not signaling danger or communicating anything to anyone down the line. It is just warm, quietly, and without ambition, in the way that Things are warm when they have finished their work and have nothing left to prove. The fire doesn't need to mean anything tonight. Neither do you. You are the warm room. You are the fire that doesn't need to signal. You are safe inside the line, and the wind from the north can pass through all the gaps in all the walls in the world, and it willn't reach you here. The stones remember nothing. The stars are patient. The wall holds its position. Sleep well.